Is this the echo chamber where freedom finally exhales, this self, alone and untethered? A silence stretches, so profound it threatens to unravel the very I that sought this stark emancipation. To need no one. The phrase itself arrives like a whisper from a glacial peak, a gauntlet thrown into the quiet dust of our dependencies. Yet, what of the invisible filaments that bind us to the pulse of the world? The shared rhythm of breath in a crowded room, the fleeting recognition in a stranger's eye, the ancient comfort of a hand held in darkness. To sever these one by one, is it a meticulous ascent to sovereign strength or a slow, imperceptible drift into a monochrome landscape populated by one? The allure of unburdened flight sings its siren song, yet these wings, newly unfurled, tremble with the weight of an unspoken dread, a vertigo of boundless possibility. Perhaps the true cage was never the presence of another, but the labyrinthine architecture of want we meticulously constructed within our own heart. And in this fervent dismantling, stone by heavy stone, what insistent phantom are we truly striving to exorcise? Is it the lingering shadow of another's judgment, the perceived tyranny of their needs, or the more intimate hollow ache of an insufficiency we project onto the world, only to reclaim it as our solitary burden? So the cords are cut, or so the mind proudly declares. A spaciousness opens, vast and initially exhilarating, like the first breath atop a desolate mountain. But the air up here is thin, and the silence, once a coveted prize, begins to echo with the ghosts of relinquished warmth. This proclaimed autonomy, does it nourish the roots of being, or merely trim the branches that once sought the sun through others? We walk this path of self-reliance, each step a careful calibration against the old patterns of leaning, of seeking validation in the gaze of another. Yet, the heart, that stubborn muscle, still beats in a rhythm learned in concert. Is freedom, then, a fortress built against the currents of human exchange, or is it the quiet realization that the ocean is within, and all shores are connected beneath the surface tumult? The anyone we strive to be free from, is it a collective entity out there, or the myriad reflections of our own fragmented self we've yet to embrace? And so the fortress of self stands, seemingly impenetrable, its ramparts polished by the winds of resolved solitude. I need no one, the banner proclaims, flapping against a sky meticulously emptied of others. But observe the sentry at the gate, how fiercely he guards this independence. Is his vigilance a sign of true strength, or of a deeper, unacknowledged terror? The freedom bought at the price of sealed-off chambers can feel indistinguishable from a more ornate prison. We might banish the specter of another's claim, only to find ourselves tethered to the rigid silhouette of the unneeding self. This new master, this ideal of pure autonomy, can be more demanding than any human bond, for it allows no cracks, no yielding, no soft descent into the shared vulnerability that makes us whole. The very act of not needing becomes a consuming need in itself, a fragile identity meticulously curated. What if the path isn't to eradicate need, but to transmute it, to see it not as a chain but as a current that flows through all existence, a dance of giving and receiving that sustains the illusion of separateness even as it binds us to the whole, the very notion of an I that could exist without anyone? From where does this fierce conviction arise? Is it not woven from the threads of shared language, inherited thoughts, the silent dialogue with a world that shaped us long before we claimed autonomy? To seek freedom from needing is perhaps to misunderstand the fundamental nature of our being, to see oneself as a solitary island when we are, in truth, peninsulas forever tethered to the mainland of existence. The air we breathe is not our own. The ground beneath our feet supports all. This relentless pursuit of a self unindebted, unentangled, could it be a chase after a phantom, a self that was never truly there in its isolated glory? Perhaps the freedom Watts gestured towards was not an escape from the intricate dance of interdependence, but a joyful, conscious participation in it, recognizing the self not as a walled garden, but as a wave inseparable from the ocean. The fear of needing, then, might be the fear of dissolving this cherished illusion of separateness, a terror of seeing the wave merge back into the water, only to discover it was water all along. And what of the quiet moments, when the performance of unneeding self-sufficiency falters? The sudden sharp pang when a hand isn't there to hold, not because it was rejected, but because the script demanded no hand be sought. There's a peculiar hollowness in that perfectly sculpted independence, a silent echo in the chambers of a heart that was taught to beat in concert with others. We meticulously erase the smudges of reliance, polish the surface of our solitude until it gleams with impenetrable strength, yet wonder at the chill it reflects. Is this the warmth of freedom, or the sterile perfection of a monument to a self that dares not admit its own humanity? Perhaps the struggle is not against needing others, but against the fear of our own vulnerability when that need is exposed. True autonomy might not be found in the absence of reliance, but in the conscious, unafraid choosing of our connections, knowing that to lean is not to fall, but to sometimes share the weight of being, which in itself is a dance of strength. Consider the architect of this grand project of needing no one, the ego, ever vigilant, ever striving to assert its singular dominion. It builds its towers of self-sufficiency, not always from a place of serene detachment, but often from a deep-seated fear of its own dissolution. To need is to admit incompletion, to acknowledge a space within that another might occupy, or worse, a space that reveals the self not as a monolith, but as a confluence. And so the battle is waged, not against external dependencies, but against the ego's terror of permeability. But what if this coveted freedom is not found in the eradication of need, but in its transcendence? To need nothing from another, because one has ceased to view the other as separate, as a source to be tapped or avoided. What if the anyone includes the rustling leaves, the curve of a line in a painting, the resonant chord in a piece of music, all elements that sustain and expand us, yet ask for no fealty to a constructed independence? Perhaps the ultimate freedom is to be so utterly porous to life, so at one with its flow, that the concept of needing or not needing simply dissolves into the wider, more generous reality of being. Imagine the sheer psychic energy expended in the constant vigilance required to need no one, the subtle calculations, the deflection of gestures that might imply reliance, the reinforcement of the solitary self. It is an exhausting architecture to maintain. What if this energy, once liberated from the task of fending off connection, could be channeled into a different kind of unfolding? A movement not away from, but towards a more authentic engagement with the present moment, in all its unscripted relational richness. This freedom, then, ceases to be a brittle shield held against the world. It becomes an open hand, capable of both giving and receiving without the tremor of fear that one might be diminished by the exchange. The anyone we sought to be independent of might then be perceived not as a threat to autonomy, but as a mirror, reflecting back the myriad facets of a self that is, by its very nature, in dialogue with existence. Perhaps the ultimate act of being free is not to need no one, but to fear no need, to meet the ebb and flow of connection with the grace of a dancer who trusts the music, the partner, and the shared space between. Is the yearning to need no one perhaps a misinterpretation of a deeper spiritual whisper, the call not to sever ties but to hold them lightly? The wisdom of non-attachment often gets distorted into a harsh edict of emotional asceticism. We imagine the enlightened being as one who walks alone, untouched and unblemished by human entanglements. Yet, is it not possible that true freedom lies in the capacity to engage fully, to love deeply, to connect authentically, all without the grasping born of fear, without the anxious clench of anticipated loss? To need no one in this revised light would not mean to exist in a vacuum. It would mean that our connections are chosen, not compulsively sought, that our giving comes from a place of abundance, not a strategy for securing return, and our receiving is met with gratitude, not a sense of owed dependency. The anyone ceases to be a potential threat or a missing piece, and instead becomes a fellow traveler in a vast, interconnected mystery. This isn't the freedom of the isolated peak, but the freedom of the river that flows to the sea, touching all banks yet beholden to none. The ambition to need no one often masks a deeper ambition, to control life, to immunize oneself against its inherent messiness and unpredictability. If I need nothing, the logic goes, then nothing can disappoint me, nothing can wound me, nothing can exert unforeseen influence over my carefully curated existence. But this desire for a sterile, controlled environment is a flight from life itself, which is by its very nature a dance of dependency and surprise. What if the freedom we seek is found not in eliminating need, but in relinquishing the obsession with control that so often fuels it? To stand open-handed before the world, acknowledging our vulnerabilities not as weaknesses, but as points of entry for genuine experience, this requires a courage far greater than that of the isolated bastion. The anyone from whom we seek independence may simply be the embodiment of life's uncontrollable elements. To embrace our interconnectedness, then, is to embrace the wild, untamable nature of reality, and to find our freedom not in resisting it, but in learning to navigate its currents with a supple and resilient spirit, knowing that even the strongest tree bends in the wind, drawing life from the very earth it depends upon. What if the path to this elusive freedom isn't through a forceful renunciation of all need, but through a profound inner listening? A descent into the quiet spaces within, where the clamor of conditioned fears and societal injunctions about independence begins to subside. Here, in this stillness, one might begin to discern the subtle difference between the ego's desperate cry for an invulnerable separateness and the soul's quiet wisdom of inherent completeness, a completeness that doesn't preclude connection but rather enriches it. To need no one might then transform from a defiant stance into a gentle realization that, at our core, we are already whole, already sustained by the very fabric of existence. From this place of inner sufficiency, relationships are no longer arenas for negotiating lack or fulfilling deficiencies. They become opportunities for shared being, for celebration, for the spontaneous dance of giving and receiving that arises not from compulsion, but from the overflow of a self that knows its own ground. A self that finds its freedom not in pushing the world away, but in recognizing its own indivisible part within it. Perhaps the rhetoric of needing no one arises from a misunderstanding of solitude's true purpose. Solitude, in its most profound sense, is not a rejection of the world, but a journey inward to meet the self more deeply, to cultivate an inner landscape rich enough to sustain one's spirit. From such a vibrant inner core, connection with others is no longer a desperate grasp for validation or completion, but an authentic sharing between two sovereign beings. The freedom found here is not predicated on the absence of anyone, but on the capacity to move fluidly between the sanctuary of self and the commonwealth of shared human experience. It's the rhythm of the tide, drawing back into the vast ocean of inner being, then surging forward to meet the shore of the other. To insist on perpetual retreat, on an unbroken state of needing no one, is to deny half of this vital pulse, to risk the sterility of an existence that, in its fierce independence, forgets the music that only an ensemble can create. True freedom might then be the wisdom to know when to be alone and when to be together, finding nourishment in both, and fearing neither. What if the anyone from whom we seek such staunch independence is not in the deepest sense truly other? If, as the mystics and philosophers like Watts suggest, the perceived boundaries between selves are more porous, more illusory than we commonly believe, then the project of needing no one takes on a curious, almost paradoxical quality. It becomes like a wave in the ocean declaring its independence from the water. In this light, the struggle for absolute non-needing might be a profound misunderstanding of our very constitution. Furthermore, in this intricate web of being, where each eye is a nodal point in a vast, interconnected consciousness, does an adamant refusal to need also inadvertently deny the flow of life itself? Does it subtly impede the natural currents of giving and receiving that characterize a living system? Perhaps true freedom is not the sterile self-containment of a stone, but the dynamic equilibrium of a star, which shines brightest by consuming and radiating, existing in a constant, vibrant exchange with the universe around it, needing and being needed in a grand cosmic dance. Could it be that the solemn quest to need no one misses a fundamental invitation to play? To dance with the ever-shifting forms of connection and solitude, rather than erecting rigid fortresses against imagined dependencies? What if need, when stripped of its fearful connotations of lack or weakness, reveals itself as a simple current in the flow of life, sometimes present, sometimes absent, but never a verdict on one's intrinsic worth or freedom? There's a peculiar lightness that enters when we cease to dramatize our interdependencies. The hand offered, the help received, the vulnerability shared. These cease to be evidence of failure in the grand project of self-sufficiency. Instead, they might be seen as moments of grace, small openings where the light of shared humanity can filter through. Perhaps the profound freedom Alan Watts pointed to isn't a stony, impervious self-reliance, but a fluid, intelligent responsiveness to life, one that can embrace needing as easily as it embraces not needing, recognizing both as textures in the rich, unrepeatable tapestry of existence. The universe, after all, doesn't strive for such stark independence. It thrives on an intricate, playful, and utterly magnificent web of mutual reliance. Perhaps the journey isn't towards a state where we heroically need no one, but towards a quiet revolution of self-acceptance. An embrace so profound that it includes our vulnerabilities, our echoes of past dependencies, our very human inclination towards connection, not as flaws to be eradicated, but as intrinsic parts of our personal landscape. When the fierce internal battle to disown these aspects ceases, a different kind of strength emerges, not the brittle strength of forced independence, but the resilient strength of a being that is at peace with its own multifaceted nature. In this space, needing loses its charge of shame or failure. It simply is. And from this calm center, the presence or absence of anyone ceases to dictate our inner state of freedom. We discover that the liberty we sought was never truly about the external configuration of our relationships, but about the internal relationship with ourselves. To be free, then, is not to be an island, but to be a whole continent, vast and varied, capable of sustaining its own life yet open to the seas that connect it to all others, without fear of being submerged or diminished. And so, the inquiry circles back, as all deep inquiries must, not to a final answer neatly packaged, but to the living pulse of the question itself. How to be free without needing anyone? Perhaps this is less a problem to be solved and more a Zen koan to be lived, a paradoxical signpost pointing towards an ever-deepening engagement with the mystery of self and other. The freedom it hints at may not be a destination of unbreachable solitude, nor an abolition of the heart's tender reach. It might be found in the subtle art of presence, in the ability to stand firmly on one's own ground, while acknowledging that this ground is, and always has been, part of a vast, shared earth. Ultimately, what if this freedom is not about the without anyone, but about transforming the very nature of our needing, from a grasp of fear to an expression of love, from a lack to be filled to a connection to be celebrated? The path unwinds with each breath in the dance between aloneness and belonging, revealing that perhaps the most profound liberty is to need, and be needed, without losing oneself, and to love, without demanding the world stand still.